I knew something was seriously wrong when the intern started calling me Mr. Legacy. Not James, not Sir, Mr. Legacy. Like I was some dusty manual they'd found in a forgotten filing cabinet. My name's James Patterson, and I'm 49 years old. I've spent 18 years building the compliance frameworks that keep Whitfield Financial from getting buried under federal penalties. But apparently, I'm now the office punchline. They treat me like that smoke detector with the dying battery, ignored until something starts burning, then suddenly, everyone remembers you exist. It started getting bad after the Henderson account incident. Our new Chief Innovation Officer, that's what Chase Whitfield calls himself now, approved a data integration without running it through compliance. 3 weeks later, we nearly had client trading records exposed because their vendor's security was basically a suggestion written on a napkin. I caught it during my 2 a.m. audit review, filed the incident report, cleaned up the regulatory mess, stayed until 4 a.m. documenting everything for the SEC filing. No thanks, no acknowledgement. Chase actually rolled his eyes when I mentioned it in the next staff meeting. So I did what any exhausted, undervalued professional with 18 years of expertise would do. I scheduled a meeting with the CEO to discuss my future here. I didn't storm in demanding anything. I had documentation. 3 binders of compliance metrics, 7 consecutive years of clean audits, SOX certifications that had saved us from multi-million-dollar penalties. The entire regulatory framework I'd personally built after the 2008 crisis nearly killed companies like ours. I sat across from Harrison Whitfield, the man who used to introduce me as our regulatory backbone at board meetings, and said simply, "I'd like to discuss a compensation adjustment. 7%, that's all I asked for. Not even enough to match what they're paying the new consultant, but fair for someone who'd kept federal regulators from dismantling our business." He didn't say no. He said, "Let's revisit this after Q3 numbers come in. Corporate speak for I'd rather burn money than acknowledge your worth." Before I go further, if you're watching this thinking, "Damn, that sounds familiar," you're not alone. Hit that subscribe button if these stories resonate. A like basically says, "I've been there too." Q3 came and went. Then Harrison announced his succession plan, and his golden child slithered into the corner office. Chase Whitfield. 28 years old, Harvard MBA, perfect teeth, and about as much understanding of financial regulations as a crypto influencer. Kept talking about right-sizing legacy processes and optimizing redundant workflows. You ever been called redundant by someone who thinks Sarbanes-Oxley is a British accounting firm? The kid brought in his consultant, Bryce Stevens. This guy once told me that maintaining 7-year audit trails was data hoarding and suggested we move to blockchain compliance solutions. I explained that federal banking regulations aren't startup problems you solve with apps. Bryce didn't appreciate my perspective. The meeting that broke everything happened on a Thursday afternoon. I'd been excluded from the morning risk assessment review, the one I'd been running for 6 years, found out from Daniel Rodriguez, our CTO, who pulled me aside after lunch looking uncomfortable. "They're making changes, James," he said quietly. "Big ones." That's when Chase called me into his office, leaned back in that ergonomic chair like he was posing for a LinkedIn influencer post. "James," he said, not looking up from his MacBook, "you're not ready for a 7% increase." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Not anger. Something worse. "I see," I said. "It's not personal. We're just moving in a different direction. More agile, less bureaucratic. Bureaucratic. 18 years of keeping this place from federal sanctions, and I was bureaucratic." I stood up slowly. "Thanks for the clarity. We appreciate everything you've built here," he added, still not meeting my eyes. "But we need compliance that moves at startup speed." I walked out of his glass fishbowl office feeling like I'd just been diagnosed with something terminal. That evening, I sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes. 18 years. I'd missed my daughter's soccer games for this place, worked through vacations, carried a phone 24/7 in case regulators called. My wife Sarah had been asking when I'd get the promotion Harrison had hinted about for 2 years. How was I going to tell her that instead of moving up, I was apparently moving out? The next morning, everything changed. I stopped staying late. No more weekend emergency reviews. No more covering for other departments' regulatory gaps. If someone needed an exemption rushed through, they could ask Chase. If legal couldn't locate the current SOX documentation, that wasn't my emergency anymore. I still did my job. Just my job. Nothing extra. The shift was immediate. I stopped answering emails after 6 p.m. Stopped explaining regulations to managers who should have learned them during onboarding. And something interesting started happening. People got nervous. Not dramatically, but I could see it. The way I suddenly got CC'd on emails again. Meeting invites that had mysteriously disappeared from my calendar started reappearing. Michelle from legal cornered me by the coffee machine. "James, are you okay? You seem different." "I'm fine," I told her, just focusing on my core responsibilities. She looked worried. "What about the Morrison account review? You always handle the compliance certification. That's not my core responsibility anymore." "Check with Chase." Her face went pale. The Morrison account was worth $25 million. Their compliance requirements were stricter than Pentagon security clearances. But that wasn't my problem now. I'd already begun what I privately called quiet preparation. Every night, I reviewed our vendor agreements, looking for something specific, something I could use. And while Chase was playing CEO dress-up, telling everyone how he was disrupting traditional compliance models, I found exactly what I was looking for. A single sentence I could embed, one that would change everything. Our vendor master agreement template. The boilerplate document that legal rubber stamped without reading if the revision log showed fewer than 10 changes. I'd been staring at Section 14, compliance verification requirements, for 3 nights straight. Nobody reads the fine print in vendor agreements, especially the 8th bullet point in subsection C, buried between liability limitations and audit cooperation clauses. I opened the template and found the standard compliance language. Generic corporate speak about appropriate regulatory oversight and standard industry practices. Meaningless fluff that sounded official but committed to nothing. Then I made one small addition. Final certification of all SOX compliance audits and regulatory filings must be completed and validated solely by Director of Compliance Systems James Patterson or his designated successor in writing. Not bolded, not highlighted. Just one sentence that looked like every other piece of regulatory boilerplate we'd been using for years. I updated the revision log with my usual dry language. Compliance authority clarification added per federal requirements. Then I uploaded the new template and watched it flow through our system. 2 vendor agreements went out that week using the new language. Then 4 more the next week. Legal never questioned it. The business development team was too busy chasing quarterly targets to read the details. Even Chase, in his weekly innovation updates, never mentioned reviewing our contract templates. Why would he? Compliance documentation was beneath his pay grade. Over the next 6 weeks, 12 major vendor agreements went out with my embedded clause. Each one digitally signed, time-stamped, and archived, each one giving me the legal equivalent of a dead man's switch. I backed up everything. Encrypted drives, cloud storage, printed copies. I even mailed a set to my brother in Phoenix. He's a CPA. He understands the value of documentation. Meanwhile, the organizational changes accelerated. Chase held weekly transformation meetings where he and Bryce redesigned our compliance processes using buzzwords like agile frameworks and risk-intelligent workflows. I sat through one session where they seriously debated whether audit reports should include more visual storytelling. I wish I was making that up. The exclusions became systematic. I wasn't copied on the quarterly risk assessment email chain, the one I'd been managing for 8 years. The vendor security briefing got rescheduled without notifying me. My name disappeared from the regulatory contacts list we sent to clients. Daniel Rodriguez started appearing at my desk more frequently. Not officially, just casual conversations that felt like reconnaissance. "You okay, James?" he asked one afternoon. "You seem different." "Just adapting to the new structure," I told him. "The Morrison people called yesterday. Asked specifically for you. Said they needed the compliance certification for their board review." My stomach tightened. Morrison Holdings was our biggest institutional client, $25 million in assets under management. Their compliance requirements made NASA's safety protocols look casual. "What did you tell them?" "That I'd check with our compliance team and get back to them." "And?" Daniel lowered his voice. "Chase told me to have Bryce handle it." I kept my expression neutral, but inside, alarms were screaming. Bryce handling Morrison compliance was like letting a food blogger perform heart surgery. "How's that working out?" I asked. Daniel's expression answered for him. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in months. I logged back into our client portal and pulled Morrison's compliance requirements. 47 pages of federal banking regulations, SEC filing protocols, and audit certification standards. Their contract specifically required annual compliance certifications signed by our designated regulatory authority, language I'd negotiated 3 years ago after their previous vendor failed an SEC inspection. Chase and Bryce had no idea what they were walking into. 2 days later, the crisis began. It started with a routine software update. Our payroll vendor pushed out a patch that should have been standard maintenance, but Bryce had streamlined our change management process, eliminating what he called bureaucratic approval workflows. The patch broke our API integration with the client reporting system. For 8 hours, transaction data was automatically syncing to a development server that should have been decommissioned 18 months ago. That server contained live client account information, social security numbers, transaction histories, account balances, everything. I found it during my weekly log review, a habit I'd maintained despite being officially excluded from vendor oversight. The timestamps were all there, documenting exactly when client data had been exposed on an unsecured system. Under SOX regulations, we had 72 hours to report the incident to affected clients and file preliminary documentation with regulators. I documented everything: screenshot timestamps, server access logs, data exposure duration, affected client counts. Then I filed it all in my personal secure folder and waited. Bryce's first response was to downplay it, called it minor data drift in an email to the senior management team, suggested it was non-material legacy system behavior. Chase went further. He told Morrison's compliance officer directly that it was a routine technical maintenance issue with no client impact. That's when I knew they'd crossed the line from incompetent to dangerous, because Morrison's contract didn't just require compliance certification. It included termination clauses for material misrepresentation of security incidents. And according to the vendor agreement they'd signed 6 weeks ago, only I could provide that certification. I opened my laptop and began typing the email that would end this charade. Subject: SOX Compliance Certification Requirement. Morrison Holdings. Simple. Professional. Just 3 sentences that would detonate everything Chase thought he'd built. But first, I wanted to watch him try to handle this himself. Sometimes the best revenge is just giving people enough rope. The Morrison Holdings compliance team didn't wait 72 hours. They called at 7:43 a.m. the next morning. I was in my kitchen making coffee and checking emails before Sarah woke up when my phone buzzed. Patricia Webb, Morrison's chief compliance officer. We'd worked together for 3 years. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. James, we've got a problem. Our overnight monitoring flagged unauthorized access to account data from your systems. Can you walk me through your incident response? My stomach dropped. Not because of the breach, I'd already documented that. Because Morrison had their own monitoring systems, and they'd caught what Bryce had tried to hide. Patricia, I need to be transparent with you. I wasn't notified of any incident. Silence on the other end, the kind that costs companies millions. You weren't notified? Her voice had gone ice-cold professional. You're our designated compliance contact. That's correct. But there have been some organizational changes here. Changes that affect our compliance certification requirements. I chose my words carefully. Changes that may affect the authority structure outlined in our service agreement. Another pause. James, I need you to send me the current compliance certification for your systems. Today. Our board meets tomorrow. I'll need to check on the current process and get back to you. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for 10 minutes, staring at my coffee. Sarah came downstairs in her robe, took one look at my face, and poured herself a cup without saying anything. Work problems? She finally asked. Big ones. She sat across from me. We'd been married 16 years. She knew when not to push for details. The thing you've been worried about? I nodded. The thing that's been keeping you up at night? It's happening today. She reached across and squeezed my hand. Whatever you need to do, James. We'll figure it out. I got to the office an hour early and went straight to Daniel's desk. He was already there, looking like he hadn't slept. We need to talk, I said quietly. We walked to the parking garage. Daniel lit a cigarette with shaking hands. Morrison called you directly, didn't they? He said. This morning. Chase is in full panic mode. Spent all night on calls with Bryce. They're trying to figure out how to handle the compliance certification. And they want to sign it themselves. I felt something cold settle in my chest. That's fraud, Daniel. I know. He took a long drag. I told them that. Chase said the contract language was outdated, and they'd update it retroactively. You can't update a signed contract retroactively. I know that. You know that. They don't seem to. At 9:15 a.m. my phone rang. Chase's assistant. Mr. Patterson, Mr. Whitfield would like to see you in his office immediately. I walked into the conference room to find Chase, Bryce, Michelle from legal, and Harrison himself. The old man looked tired and angry. Chase didn't waste time. We need you to sign the Morrison compliance certification. Today, I haven't reviewed the current systems. Bryce has handled everything. Just sign off on his work. I looked at the document they'd prepared. 3 pages of generic compliance language that wouldn't pass a community college business class review, much less federal regulatory standards. This isn't compliant with SOX requirements. Bryce spoke up. We've modernized the approach. This covers all the essential elements. No, I said quietly. It doesn't. Chase's voice went sharp. James, this isn't a discussion. Morrison needs this certification today, or we lose the contract. Then you should have involved me in the process. We restructured. You're not the primary compliance contact anymore. I pulled out my phone and opened the Morrison service agreement, the one they'd signed 2 months ago using our updated template. Section 14.3, I read aloud. Final certification of all SOX compliance audits and regulatory filings must be completed and validated solely by Director of Compliance Systems James Patterson or his designated successor in writing. The room went dead silent. Harrison leaned forward. What the hell is that? Chase looked confused. That's not... We changed the reporting structure. You changed internal reporting, Michelle said slowly, reading over my shoulder. But this is a binding contract clause, Bryce tried to recover. That's obviously outdated language. We can amend the contract terms. With Morrison's agreement, Michelle said, and they'd have to approve any changes to compliance authority. Harrison's voice was dangerously quiet. How long has this language been in our contracts? About 2 months, I said. It's in 12 active vendor agreements. Chase's face went red. You did this deliberately. You sabotaged our restructuring. I documented the compliance authority that our clients require. This is insubordination. Harrison held up a hand. Shut up, Chase. He looked at me. James, what exactly are you saying? I'm saying that according to the contracts we've signed, I'm the only one who can certify compliance for our major clients. And I haven't been involved in any compliance processes for 2 months. So our certifications are invalid? Any certifications signed without my approval would be questionable under the contract terms. The implications hit them like a freight train. Invalid compliance certifications meant contract violations. Contract violations meant client departures. Client departures meant... Harrison's phone rang. He looked at the caller ID and went pale. Morrison Holdings, he answered on speaker. Patricia Webb's voice filled the room. Harrison, we need to discuss the compliance certification issue. Our legal team has reviewed the incident response, and we have concerns about your current compliance authority structure. Chase tried to jump in. Patricia, this is Chase Whitfield. I can address any concerns you have about our compliance processes. Mr. Whitfield, our contract specifies that James Patterson is our compliance contact. We need his certification for the incident response, or we'll have to invoke the non-compliance clauses in our agreement. Harrison looked at me. For the first time in months, really looked at me. James, Patricia continued, are you available to review and certify the incident response documentation? Everyone in the room was staring at me. Chase looked like he was about to have a stroke. Bryce was frantically typing on his phone. Michelle was reading the contract language with growing horror. I smiled, not smugly, just the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd been playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. I'll need to review everything from the beginning, Patricia. It may take some time to properly assess the situation. How much time? I looked directly at Chase. That depends on how cooperative everyone is with the review process. The next 48 hours felt like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. Harrison ended the call with Morrison and sat in silence for a full minute. Nobody moved. Chase looked like he was trying to solve calculus in his head. Bryce had gone pale and kept glancing at the door like he was calculating escape routes. James, Harrison said finally, I need to understand the full scope of this situation. I pulled out the folder I'd been preparing for 2 months. Not thick, just 30 pages of documentation that told the whole story. Email chains showing my systematic exclusion from compliance processes, screenshots of Slack messages where Chase dismissed SOX requirements as legacy bureaucracy, timestamps documenting when vendor oversight was transferred to Bryce without proper authorization. One message thread made Harrison's jaw clench. Chase had written, "James is stuck in 2008 thinking, we need compliance that moves at startup speed." Startup speed? Harrison's voice was dangerously quiet. "We're a federally regulated financial services firm, not a goddamn app company." Chase tried to recover. "Dad, we were modernizing outdated processes. James wasn't adapting to the new paradigm." "The paradigm where you ignore federal banking regulations?" I spoke up quietly. "Harrison, there's something else you need to know. The Morrison incident wasn't isolated. I showed him the documentation. 3 other vendor security gaps that had been downplayed or ignored. 2 client data exposures that hadn't been properly reported. A pattern of regulatory shortcuts that could trigger SEC investigations if discovered. How bad is this, James? Right now, manageable if we act quickly. If Morrison terminates and word spreads to other clients..." I paused. "We could be looking at $75 million in contract cancellations and potential federal violations." The room went dead silent. Harrison looked at his son like he was seeing him for the first time. "Get out." "Dad, I can fix this. We just need to..." "Get out." Chase left. Bryce followed without being asked. Michelle from legal stayed, taking notes like she was documenting evidence for future litigation. Harrison turned to me. "What do you need to fix this?" "Full compliance authority restored immediately, access to all vendor agreements and client communications, and I need to personally handle the Morrison certification process." "Done." "What else?" "Chase can't be involved in any regulatory decisions going forward. This isn't personal, it's risk management. He doesn't understand the consequences of compliance failures." Harrison nodded slowly. "I'm removing him from operational oversight. He'll focus on strategic initiatives. Corporate speak for exile to meaningless projects." Over the next week, I worked 12-hour days rebuilding what had been broken. I personally called every client affected by the security incidents, provided detailed incident reports, walked them through our remediation plans. Most importantly, I recertified our entire compliance framework, documenting every control, every process, every safeguard that kept us from regulatory trouble. Morrison Holdings agreed to maintain their contract after my comprehensive incident response review. Patricia Webb told me privately that they'd been considering termination until I took over the process. "We trust you, James," she said. "We don't trust inexperienced consultants handling our regulatory requirements." 2 weeks later, Harrison called me into his office. He looked older, tired. The stress of nearly losing the company had taken its toll. "The board met yesterday," he said. "We discussed your role going forward." I waited. "We're creating a new position. Chief Compliance Officer, executive level, reporting directly to me. Full authority over all regulatory functions." He slid a contract across the desk. I read through it carefully. The salary increase was more than the 7% I'd originally requested. The equity package was modest but meaningful. 4% vested shares. But the real prize was the title and authority. No more being sidelined or excluded. No more watching consultants dismantle systems I'd spent years building. "There's one more thing," Harrison said. "I'm announcing Chase's transition to our strategic development division. He'll focus on long-term planning and innovation projects, away from day-to-day operations." I nodded. "That's probably wise. James, I owe you an apology. I should have recognized what was happening sooner. Should have protected the expertise you've built here." "We all make mistakes," I said. "The important thing is learning from them." 3 months later, I was sitting in my new office, corner suite with actual windows, reviewing compliance reports when Daniel Rodriguez knocked on my door. "Got a minute, Chief?" I smiled, still getting used to the title. "Morrison just called," he said. "They're expanding their contract, want us to handle compliance for 2 more subsidiaries, specifically requested that you personally oversee the integration. Good news travels fast. Word is spreading that we actually know what we're doing again. 3 other institutional clients have reached out about expanding services." That evening, I drove home feeling lighter than I had in years. Sarah was in the kitchen making dinner when I walked in. "How was your day, Mr. Chief Compliance Officer?" "Productive. Morrison expanded their contract. We're looking at about $15 million in additional business over the next 2 years." She kissed me. "I'm proud of you. For standing up for yourself. For not letting them push you out." "I didn't stand up to them," I said. I just stopped enabling their incompetence. What's the difference? Sometimes the best way to fight bad leadership isn't confrontation. It's just refusing to clean up their messes anymore. My daughter Emma came into the kitchen, soccer cleats in hand. "Dad, can you come to my game Saturday? Coach says we're playing the championship team." I thought about my calendar. Under the old system, I would have been working weekends, covering for other people's mistakes, fixing problems I hadn't caused. "Wouldn't miss it," I said. That night, I checked the company's quarterly compliance metrics. Perfect scores across all major regulatory frameworks. 0 incidents. Client satisfaction at an all-time high. Chase was apparently doing well in strategic development. Harrison had given him an innovation lab budget and told him to think big picture. Translation: expensive sandbox to keep him away from anything important. I heard through Daniel that Bryce's consulting contract hadn't been renewed. As I closed my laptop, I thought about the embedded clause that had changed everything. One sentence, buried in routine paperwork, that had restored the proper order of things. Sometimes power isn't seized dramatically. Sometimes it's just documented carefully and claimed when the moment comes. You don't demand respect from people who don't understand competence. You create conditions where respect is the only logical response. Thanks for listening to my story. Hit that subscribe button if corporate chess moves like this resonate with you. And remember, never underestimate the person who actually knows how things work. They're usually holding better cards than you think.